foundation to receive the Messiah. What's necessary for it to be possible for God to be able to send the Messiah?
You need a nation.
What?
A nation.
You need a foundation of faith and foundation of substance. Okay, now that's the theological terms. So how does that cash out into the real world? Neil?
A state which can protect itself.
A state which can protect itself, that's partly, yeah, part of it. The Messiah needs to be protected, yeah. What else?
People understand what they're talking about.
Right, so the foundation of faith, this means you need to have a people, a nation, a spiritual community which is living a spiritual and religious life. So when the Messiah pops up and starts telling them about God, they know what he's talking about. Yeah, he doesn't need to persuade them that God exists. Yeah, so they need a spiritual community that is living a religious life, and so they're aware to the presence of God, and they're able to recognize the Messiah and to understand what he's talking about, and to realize that what he's talking about is sensible and, answers the questions that they have. That's the first thing. So what's the foundation of substance? How does that cash out? Okay, what went wrong with Cain and Abel? Cain killed Abel. Okay, so what is the foundation of substance in practice then? Let him live. Okay, so what kind of society are we talking about then? What? Okay, a society which is at peace. All right.
Relative freedom of speech.
There's freedom of speech, freedom of religion. In other words, the Messiah comes along, he starts talking about God, and he has different ideas than everybody else. Then they may disagree with him, they may argue with him, but at the end of the day, they can't put him in prison and kill him. Yeah, so there has to be the rule of law, the basic, what nowadays we call human rights, but in those days it would have been a law-governed society in which there's freedom of assembly, so he could meet together with his friends, freedom of speech, so he could stand and say what he wants, and freedom of religion. So that's what the foundation of substance means substantially. So you think about that, how common is that in human history to have a society in which there's freedom of speech and freedom of religion? Very rare, isn't it? Very rare to find that kind of society, but that's what God needs to create. That's the national foundation for the Messiah, is a spiritual community in which there's freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So when the Messiah comes, he can persuade people through his words and his deeds to accept him, to recognize him, to accept him. Yeah? Okay, so that's the kind of foundation that God needs to establish. So if we have a look at how far God got, then we looked at in Jacob's family, well, in Abraham's family, you saw how the foundation of substance was established to a limited extent with Jacob and Esau. Why do I say to a limited extent?
They continued to work with each other after.
Yes, so they met, they reconciled, but actually then the descendants of Jacob were the Jews, the descendants of Esau were the Edomites, and they remained two different people, and they were fought against each other quite a bit. Well, so that's why I looked at, so you can see there what happened at reconciliation of Jacob and Esau. They were reconciled, but they weren't genuinely united. And so that didn't happen until Jacob's sons, with Esau, with Joseph and his brothers, and then particularly, as we looked at last week, with Judah and Benjamin. Where Judah in the position of Cain, Benjamin in the position of Abel. Judah's willing to risk his life and give his life to save his brother Benjamin. And so that then became a genuine, lasting foundation of substance. And those two brothers, they really embraced and loved each other. And so hundreds of years later, the southern kingdom was the two tribes of Benjamin and Judah. And the Messiah actually comes from the line of Judah. So the first king, Saul, came from Benjamin, and then the second king, David, came from Judah, and the Messiah is descended from the line of Judah. So that was where this lasting foundation of substance was established, as between Judah and Benjamin. But anyway, still, it's only on a sort of family, tribal level. Whereas when we look at Satan's foundation on individual level, lots of nasty people wandering around, big bullies, lots of criminal mafia type of families, lots of tribes going around attacking other people, society and a nation, in which there is no religious freedom, which are incredibly oppressive, such as Egypt, which is an empire, in which there's a pharaoh who is worshipped as God, and everybody basically lived to serve and was slaves of the pharaoh. And so Satan, in that sense, Satan's foundation was on a national or even international level with the Egyptian and Assyrian empires, in which there wasn't this kind of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and social mobility, which is necessary foundation for the Messiah to come. And so if the Messiah had come in Jacob's family or shortly afterwards, very easily they would have come into some conflict and they could easily have been wiped out. So, as Neil was saying, there was no state, no foundation to protect the Messiah. So that's why God needed to stand up a national foundation. And so that's why there was this delay. Okay, so the pattern then for overcoming Satan was established by Jacob, and then more particularly by Joseph, and then Judah and Benjamin. And this pattern was followed then by Moses and later on by Jesus, and then, of course, by our true parents. So let's have a look then in more detail. National foundation to receive the Messiah. Need to make a foundation of faith. There's a central person to do that, and that is Moses. So he then makes the foundation of faith, and through a certain period of time, and this qualifies him to stand as a central figure for the foundation of substance. So he has to go through a period of 40 years, which was of restoration. And then this is just the general. The offering then becomes following the word of God, which means living a spiritual life. The foundation of substance means they need to remove their fallen nature. To restore the foundation of substance, they need to overcome their fallen nature, which is the unity between Moses and the Hebrews. And on that basis, it means that the foundation for the Messiah to come on a national level. And of course, this requires divine grace, God's 95%, and human will, 5%, for God's will to be done. Okay? So that's the sort of national foundation to see the Messiah, living the spiritual life, overcoming the fallen nature, so you don't get upset and kill people who've got better ideas than you've got. And, yeah. Okay, so what was life like in Egypt? Well, Jacob took his family down into Egypt. And while they were there, they prospered and multiplied. So, do you remember, why did they end up in Egypt?
Famine.
Okay, there's a famine, and then Joseph became the... Okay, do you remember what Joseph's economic policies were?
7 years.
Selling all the grain.
Saving in time.
Okay, right. So Pharaoh got the dream: 7 years of famine, of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And so during the 7 years of plenty, he stored up the grain, and during the 7 years of famine, he sold the grain to the Egyptians. And first of all, the first couple of years, they came up with their money from their savings, and then what happened? They ran out of money, and what do? They had to sell their property, and then they sold themselves. So after the 7 years, they accused Joseph and they said, because of your policies, we are now all slaves to the Pharaoh. Okay? But it's interesting because it says that because Joseph was a prime minister, he invited his family in, and his family then owned land, and they prospered and multiplied. So through his economic policies, Joseph managed to reduce all the Egyptians to slavery, but he and his family became very wealthy landowners and multiplied and prospered, and they were foreigners living inside Egypt. How do you think that went down? So what do you think? That's right. Okay, so what do you think about Joseph's economic policies in retrospect then?
Not very brilliant. Not very brilliant.
No, basically, he was taking advantage of the people's situation to sell the grain. What could he have done instead? He could have given it out, That's what the state's supposed to do. And that's, the whole idea of the state with a public purpose. At that point, the state should have, instead of selling it all, it should have just distributed it freely during that period of famine and not deprive people of their property, everything. Yeah. So that was, anyway, so you see these kind of policies when governments want to tax everything that moves. Yeah?
I mean, it sounds a bit much to expect Israel to do something so enlightened. But then again, the Romans did do that.
Anyway, the point of these things being in the Bible is that there's lessons to be learnt. And you see some politicians who want to have huge punitive rates of taxation because they don't like the fact that some people are wealthy. There's huge inheritance taxes and all these other taxes which they have, such that more than half the money that an ordinary person owns goes in taxation to the state. Anyway, so they prospered and multiplied, and you can imagine they were not very popular. Anyway, so there rose a new king over Egypt who didn't know about Joseph, and this new king thought, who are all these foreigners living in my country, who are also rich and wealthy, they might take over. Yes? Again, familiar kind of story. So lots of lessons here, very contemporary. And so he said, right, I need to try and do something about this. And so the Pharaoh came up with a cunning plan, and he had this idea of these grandiose building projects. And so public works, project, building the pyramids, place for him to live when he died. And so he would, put out the contract. Lots of people, be employed by the Pharaoh, by the state. And so a lot of Egyptians started working for the Pharaoh on this building project. But the rate of pay was very good. So a lot of the Hebrews decided, well, that's good money. We're going to go and work on the building site as well. And so a lot of them left their jobs and businesses and everything. They went to work. And then the Pharaoh said, right, now everybody's working for me. Now I'm going to change the employment legislation. And changed it so that only the Egyptians could be the foreman. And all the Hebrews could only be laborers. Okay? And then after a while, he started to increase the wages that were paid to the Egyptian foreman and lower the wages that were given to the Hebrews. And if some of the Hebrews thought, well, we're not getting paid very well, we're going back to our old jobs, then they were intimidated and beaten up and killed, so they had to carry on working. And gradually the wages got lower and lower and lower until they were reduced effectively to slavery. And that's the way it worked. And and so that's why under communism, led to the abolition of private property. Everybody had to work for the state, and of course, you lost your freedom. You couldn't open your mouth because you had nowhere else to go and work. There are these huge building projects. So this is Goshen, which is where the Hebrews are thought to have lived. And so you see those feet. I mean, from the base there is about 15 feet. You can imagine how tall that statue would have been. They were huge. Massive. I mean, you can go to the British Museum. You can see some of these things. Yeah, the statues there. They were just phenomenal, large. And so that's where they were. So they ended up becoming slaves, but they weren't the first slaves. The Egyptians were the first slaves. Okay, so you now had the first national course to restore Canaan. So what were they doing? What was this sort of other reason why they were in Egypt?
Because of Abraham's mistake.
Right, so Abraham made a mistake during the offering. Now, if Abraham had not made that mistake, what would have happened? They would have stayed in Canaan. They were living in Canaan when Abraham made the offering. And if you remember, the reason why God told Abraham to make the offering was that God said to Abraham, your descendants will number the stars of heaven, and Abraham believed and it was counted to him as righteousness. Then God said, your descendants will live in the land of Canaan forever. And Abraham said, but how am I to know this? So he expressed doubt. And so he had to restore his faith. And that's why he had to make this offering. So God said, make this offering of the heifer, the goat, the sheep, and the dove, and the pigeon. And if he'd made that offering successfully, then he would have restored his faith, restored the foundation of faith, and then his descendants would have lived in Canaan for 400 years. Because he didn't make that he didn't restore the foundation of faith, because he didn't cut the bird and the pigeon, then God said your descendants will be living in a foreign land for 400 years. So the point is, 400 years had to go past anyway, because that was the amount of time it took to get from the family level to the national level in order for the Messiah to come. So if they'd stayed in Canaan, they would have spent 400 years in prosperity, prospering in Canaan, and then the Messiah would have come at that point. But instead they spent 400 years in Egypt, in which case it's necessary to have a national course to restore to Canaan. In other words, to go back to Canaan after this 400 years. They could go back to where they're supposed to be if Abraham hadn't made the mistake. Make sense? Okay, so how did Moses then become the central figure? Well, he was a son of Amram and Jochebed, and Amram was the leader of the synagogue. True or false?
No.
Sorry?
The Bible.
What?
Is it? Not the Bible.
No, it's not in the Bible, it's in the Talmud. But what's the other problem? It's anachronistic. Synagogues didn't appear till 1,500 years later. But anyway, he was some kind of religious leader. And Jochebed was his mother. Anyway, you know the story that the Pharaoh, the Hebrews kept multiplying. The Pharaoh wanted to stop them from multiplying, so he introduced a very drastic form of birth control, which was when the boys are born, they were killed. And I suppose the girls were, employed to be maids and other things in the palace. And then Jochebed, she didn't want her son to be killed, so as you know, she put him in this basket, put him on the river. His sister went to look after him, keep an eye on him. The princess came down to the river, and she saw him, had compassion upon him, and he was brought up grew up in the palace. And so the midwives then, who the Pharaoh told to kill all these boys, they refused to do that. So God's providence then started because of disobedience. Was the Pharaoh's daughter obedient or disobedient? Was she an obedient or disobedient girl?
Did she know Moses was an Israelite?
Oh yeah, sure.
She must have lied to her father about it.
Right, so she was disobeying the command of her father. She was risking her life to save Moses, a person of extraordinary compassion. Yeah, even though she knew that was against the law, she was disobeying the Pharaoh, who was her father. She risked her life by disobeying him to save Joseph's life. Anyway, so he grew up in the palace, and he's also brought up by his mother. Actually, he's employed as a wet nurse. Do you know what wet nurses are?
Yeah, breastfeeding.
Yes. So if the mother runs out of milk, employs another mother to breastfeed. So his mother then ended up being employed as his nanny and wet nurse. And so she brought him up then, knowing his identity as a Hebrew in some way. And also he grew up with a very strong sense of justice. So when he was 40 years old then, so you can imagine he's brought up as I don't know who that is. He's brought up as a prince in the palace, so he received an extraordinarily good education. Yeah? A very good education. And then when he was 40 years old, he was sort of wandering around the building site, as one does, and he saw an Egyptian slave driver whipping and beating one of the Hebrews unfairly and unjustly, and he felt really angry. He had a very strong sense of justice, and so he went and he killed the Egyptian slave driver. Okay, so through this, then so you can imagine the people, the Hebrews, they knew that Moses was their man in that sense. They knew he was brought up in the palace. But how do you think they felt about him growing up in the palace?
Yeah,
Okay, why might they felt resentful?
because they had such a tough life and he...
That's right, they may have felt, it's just not fair, is it? He's growing up in the palace, a life of luxury, and here we are slaving away. So that's one, I'm sure some of them might have felt that. Some of them also might have thought, well, when's he going to show his true colours and come to help us and save us? Anyway, so by killing the Egyptian slave driver, on the one hand, he was showing the people that he was a patriot, that he was revealing his identity, that he loved them. He was a patriot, a true Hebrew. And also the other side, he was, by killing the Egyptian slave driver, he was putting himself outside beyond the pale of being Egyptian. I don't know who that was. And, had to leave the palace. So, do you think it was a good idea for him to kill the Egyptian slave driver or not?
Good idea.
You think it's a good idea? Okay.
I think it was.
I mean, do you think it's okay to go and kill somebody? Maybe.
Depends.
Well, it's very arbitrary justice. What do you think? Was that okay? Supposing all right. That's the choice he made. He killed the Egyptian slave driver. What were the consequences of that? The one consequence was he had to ended up leaving the palace and ended up going to the desert. Okay, imagine if he hadn't killed the Egyptian slave driver, then what?
He was still in the palace, so he had some option.
Didn't we actually find out that if he had not only Egyptian and had stayed in the palace, he might have ended up becoming emperor of Egypt. And to make the journey for the Israelites,
Yeah.
he needed to go back to Canaan so much easier.
Yeah, and another part. I mean, there are lots of different possibilities. We know what happened. Supposing he had this very strong sense of identity as a Hebrew, yet been able to overcome his anger and kill the Egyptian slave driver, then maybe he could have continued in the palace, and maybe it might have been possible to come to some kind of political settlement. He might even have become the Pharaoh, in which case, if he'd kept his identity as a Hebrew and became the Pharaoh, then he could have, you would have had this unity there of Hebraism, the religious perspective, and Hellenism, which originally came out of Egypt anyway. This sort of scientific approach could have been synthesized together. And maybe something could have gone forward in that way. Maybe you wouldn't have had this separation of Hebraism and Hellenism, which is what did happen. No, that's one possibility. But of course, if he didn't kill him out of fear, then that would have been a disaster, because he wouldn't have, he wouldn't have done anything. Anyway, that's what he chose to do. That was his choice, and that's what he did, and so God worked with the consequences of that. But there may have been plan A. This may have been plan B. What we're working on at the moment is plan Z squared. Seriously. If you think things are the way they're supposed to be, they're seriously not. Yeah? That's always important to remember. The way things are is not the way things are supposed to be. It should have been different. Yeah? And then it helps us to remember that, Okay, so what should have happened next then? Well, as I said, the Hebrews, they should have recognized, actually Moses, who's brought up in the palace, he is a true patriot. Yes? And they should have really loved Moses. And then they should have respected Moses, because they should have realized that he's had a really good education. Even though he was brought up in the palace, he had the opportunity to live a life of luxury, he's decided to risk his life to protect us. And so you should have respected him because he's so, incredible potential as a leader, has such a good education, but also because he made a stand for them, for justice. Then they should have listened to him. So they said to Moses, right, what should we do? And then he would have guided them and led them in the right way. Don't know what that would have been, but anyway, he would have done that. And then together, they would have worked together and multiplied and created a lot of goodness. That's what should have happened. And then they would have gone to Canaan then in 21 days, according to the Bible. Very easily could have gone over to Canaan, straight road, taken the highway. So what did happen? Well, sometime later, I can't remember if it was the next day or next week, then Moses saw two Hebrews fighting with each other, and he came along to intervene. And then one of them said, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. So they said, "Who made you a prince and judge over us?" So what does that show about the way they thought about Moses?
They were jealous of him.
Yeah, they didn't respect him. Yeah, they didn't recognize his... Sorry?
He couldn't control himself.
That's what they thought, yeah. And the first part, who made you a prince and judge over us? In other words, they didn't recognize that he had any authority. And then, do you mean to kill me as you kill the Egyptian? In other words, you need to practice a bit more self-control. Is this your idea of justice, going arbitrarily, killing the person you think is wrong? Yeah, so they couldn't respect him because of what he'd done. On the one side, you can see he was that side, but from a more rational point of view, who is this guy, a loose cannon, just goes around, killing people he thinks are in the wrong, Do we really want him as a leader? Yeah? So that's, so Moses was afraid, thought the thing is known, and suddenly realized, actually, if everybody's heard about him killing the Egyptian slave driver, there's going to be a warrant out for his arrest, and, he needed to escape. So, the first national foundation of see the Messiah then was a failure. Yeah? On both sides, there were errors, you can see, if we try and unpick it. So it's always important, to try and understand things from the different people's point of view. What was going on in Moses' mind? To the extent that we can use our imagination, how would those actions have appeared to an ordinary Hebrew? Yes, it's very easy to judge them. Yeah? But if we try and understand it, okay, we can understand why they reacted like that. Yeah, maybe there was some reason why they reacted like that, yeah? It wasn't just their fault. Maybe Moses, these things are really complicated. And then one day we might find ourselves in a similar situation, then we can understand, it's not good to judge so easily.
Also, I think that if an Egyptian prince had killed a lower level Egyptian, he might get in some trouble. But because Moses wasn't originally Egyptian, I'm sure there was lots of plotting in the palace against him. The position was a little bit precarious. Possibly,
yeah. I mean, the law in those days was that if you're an aristocrat and you killed a slave, you were not punished. That was the way it was. There was not, you read the Code of Hammurabi and these things. There were laws, and the law applied differently depending upon what level of society you were.
You have to pay a fine or something.
Yeah, if it was somebody else's slave, you pay a fine. If it was your own slave, well, he's your slave. You can do what you like with him.
Moses was a kind of interloper, and some of the other princes were looking for any excuse.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. A lot of politics going on inside the palace, I'm sure. Anyway, so Moses then, he fled. So that's what's so remarkable then about Jewish law, is that it's the one law that applies equally to everyone. It's the idea of the rule of law came from there. That was a completely original contribution to the ancient world, in which there were different laws, for different levels of society. Anyway, so he fled to the wilderness of Midian. It's outside Egypt. And when he was there, he went to get a drink. He found some ladies around a well who had been harassed, and so he drove off the harassers and looked after them, protected them. He found out their dad was called Jethro. Where do we more normally associate the word Jethro with? Jethro Tull. Who was he?
He invented the seed drilling.
That's right. There's the one who invented the seed drill in the agricultural revolution, and for those who are living in the modern world, it was a band. That's right.
It's not modern, though.
Who are living in my modern world? Okay, all right. Anyway, that's Jethro, priest of Midian. And the story goes that actually he was, this is again from the Talmud, that he was actually in the Egyptian's court, and he opposed the idea of turning the Hebrews all into slaves. He didn't like that idea, and so he had to flee, and he went off to Midian. Anyway, so he married Zipporah, who was one of his daughters.
So he was an Egyptian, Jethro?
That's traditional in the Talmud, yeah. Anyway, he married Zipporah, who was one of his daughters, and they had 2 sons, and he became a shepherd. And where is all this going on? Well, it's Ramses. That's where, according to tradition, the Hebrews were building the pyramids and the huge city of Ramses, which has been uncovered recently using satellite things. You can pick out it's still there. It's extraordinary under the sand. Anyway, if they'd followed Moses, they would have gone 21 days up to Canaan, but in the end he had to flee to Midian, which is there on the other side of, was that the Gulf of Aqaba? No, it's over there. Okay, so second national course to restore Canaan. And so what conditions should be established in the second course? Well, it's the same as the first one. Again, the foundation of faith was Moses. The object, conditional object, was the tablets, which are the word of God, and the time period of 40 years. And again, this time they should have loved, respected, submitted, and multiplied goodness together with Moses. So Moses then is the one who has to make the foundation of faith, which then qualifies him to be the central person for the foundation of substance. In other words, he's able to... What do you need to do if you're the leader? Yeah? Sorry?
Represent God.
Okay, so if you... And how does that work?
By embodying it yourself.
Yes, and so... Yes, and then you very, very sort of have a certain charismatic. You know, people can actually feel the spiritual energy, can feel God's blessings, God's presence, and God's word flowing through you, and so it's much easier for people to respect you. But if you don't make a foundation of faith, and you try to lead, and people can't feel love or truth or anything coming from you, then what?
Your church is empty.
That's right, it's very difficult. So the foundation of faith is a condition to stand in the position of able, to be able to mediate God's love and God's truth. Yeah, so that's why Abel has to make the foundation of faith, separate from Satan. By separating from Satan means he can come into the presence of God, and God is able to work through him. When he's standing there at the pulpit, giving the sermon, people feel the presence and the grace of God. Yeah. Okay.
Do you think it made it difficult for the Israelites? Because I'm surprised that Moses, with his education and patriotism, he didn't marry an Egyptian woman. He didn't marry an Israeli woman. Isn't that a little bit surprising, considering his position and his faith and the love of his people?
Well, he was in Midian. I mean, there were no Hebrews living in Midian.
Oh, he was 40, but he could have married.
Sorry?
He could have married within his first 40 years in Egypt.
No, as a prince in the palace, you can't go and marry a slave. It's just socially unacceptable. Yeah.
Also, I remember that, in the Jewish tradition, the woman carries on Jewish lineage.
Yes.
So, was it already back then, this kind of tradition, or when did this develop?
Much later, yeah.
A lot later.
Yeah, there were lots of people within who converted to Judaism. Judaism was a religion that people were converting to up until the time of Constantine. And Constantine passed laws making it against the law to convert to Judaism.
Oh,
And that's why it's the way it is today.
And Jews adapted to that, yeah. So Jews don't engage in evangelical missionary activity now, for all kinds of reasons, but it was actually, a lot of Christians were converting and becoming Jews. And so the church didn't like the fact that a lot of the Christians were converting to Judaism, so they persuaded Constantine to pass a law, and then gradually this anti-Jewish legislation became stronger and stronger and stronger.
When the Christians converted to Judaism,
Yeah.
did they become Jews but retain their belief that Jesus was the Messiah, or did they have to jettison that to become
Not necessarily. At that time it was a lot more fluid than it is now. And a lot of them, there were Gentiles who became Christians, but then they've realized Jesus was a Jew. If I want to go much more deeply into the religion of Jesus, I need to go and study Judaism, and often became Jews. And so they regarded Christianity was seen as Judaism light. But, because you don't get circumcised, you don't follow the kosher laws, there's only a few laws you have to follow, whereas Judaism is a lot more rigorous. Yeah, and so that's the way it was. I mean, the early centuries, there was a lot more fluid, people going from one to the other, Judaism to Christianity, Christianity to Judaism. And anyway, so that's what should have happened then. So Moses then made this foundation of faith. And during this period of 40 years then, he was in the desert of Midian, 40 years as a shepherd. And so by the time he encountered God, he was how old? 80. And real OAP. He thought, I've retired, got a nice peaceful life. And then after his 40 years, and then he encountered God. He saw this burning bush, and he saw that it wasn't burning. It wasn't being consumed, so he went up to it. God told him, you're standing on holy ground, take off your shoes. So he took off his shoes or sandals, And then God spoke to him and said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So how did God introduce himself?
The Jewish God.
There weren't Jews in those days.
Or an Israeli God then.
Not even, it wasn't even really an Israeli God. It's not talk,
God of your ancestors.
partly the God of your ancestors, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yeah, it's very much like a personal God. I'm the God of these individuals. Yeah, very important insight in Judaism. God is, you can have a personal relationship with God. God takes a personal interest in every single human being. It's not the abstract, God. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God was identifying himself, so Moses would know who he was, who this voice was. Was this a voice that could be relied upon and trusted? Yes, because it was the God of his ancestors, about which he would have known. I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out, and because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So again, what does this reveal about the nature of God? Yeah, God is a God of compassion. Most essentially, God feels and cares about his people. He cares about their suffering. And God would have liked to have intervened before this time, but he couldn't, because he had to wait till this 400-year period passed. So during this period of 400 years, what was Satan trying to do? Kill them? Break their faith, yes. So they had to restore this foundation of faith for 400 years, which meant they had to maintain their identity. So Satan had 400 years to try and destroy Abraham's descendants. So if after 400 years there were no people who believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there'd be no people to take out of Egypt back into Canaan. And so you can imagine then, when the Hebrews were reduced to slavery, what do you think their choices were?
Be resentful.
Okay, they could become resentful and bitter and a sort of bitter people, consumed by a sense of victimhood and resentment, and in that case, would have been spiritually paralyzed.
Another choice is keep your identity and therefore continue to be singled out, or lose your identity and therefore make it so unclear so you consider that you're Egyptian.
Right, they could have taken out Egyptian citizenship. They could have said, I'm going to renounce my Hebrew identity and I want to become an Egyptian. Yeah? And then, if enough people, I'm sure there were Hebrews that did that. I'm sure there were ones that decided, well, why should I suffer just because I'm a Hebrew? If I become an Egyptian, I can become a slave master, slave driver, etc., etc.
Many Koreans in Japan, they took Japanese names, Japanese family names.
Yeah. And so then, if you do that, then you become assimilated. So what Satan was trying to do, is trying to make the Hebrews lose their sense of self, lose their identity, so they became assimilated with the Egyptians, so that after 400 years, there'd be nobody to bring out. And the Hebrews thought, why should we be different and be treated so badly? What's so important about, this and this, keeping our identity, keeping our lineage, and living so miserably as a result of it? Why can't we be like everyone else? Why do we have to be different? Yeah, similar conversations been going on forever. Yeah, why should we be different? Anyway, so that was a challenge, and they maintained it. Enough of them, anyway, maintained their identity as Hebrews, maintained the traditions of keeping the Sabbath, probably a circumcision, and all these kind of traditions, the way in which they maintained and kept their identity. Yeah, circumcision and Sabbath and things like this. And and also their faith in God, so that when Moses appeared, they could relate to him. Anyway, so it reveals here that God cares. God is a God of compassion. God feels people suffering as his own and wants to help and relieve people of their suffering. So what goes on next? So Moses then has a discussion with God. So God says, I'm concerned about all my people. And so God says to Moses, so God says to Moses, I'm going to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. I'm going to bring them into the land of Canaan. So now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So how do you think Moses felt? Go. I'm sending you to take the people out of Egypt.
He's telling he's dying.
You know, what? I've retired, man. And so Moses, naturally enough, he says, where is it? Oh, I've lost my cursor.
It's on the screen.
Oh, it's over there, is it? Oh, thank you.
We're following it.
It sort of wandered off. Okay, so Moses says, who am I? In other words, if I go along and I go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go, he's going to say, well, who are you? A shepherd come out of the desert. Why should I pay any attention to you? And so Moses said, man, that's not a really good plan. Got to do better than that.
It's interesting that God said, I am who I am, and Moses said, who am I?
Yeah? But anyway,
Okay, so now I know who you are, but
that's right. And then, but God said, I will be with you. And this will be a sign to you that it is I who sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you'll worship me on this mountain. Does that sound like a plan? God says to Moses, don't worry, I'll be there with you. And just to prove that I'm with you, after you've done the job and you brought them all out to worship me here, then I'll provide the evidence. No. Moses thought, man, you know, you may be God, but the world doesn't work like that. And so Moses said, okay. They'll ask, what is your name? Yeah, they're going to say, well, which God is it, in other words? You know, Moses says, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, this is to the Israelites first, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they'll ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, and normally we say, I am who I am, but actually in the Hebrew it says, I will be who I will be. This is what you're to say to the Israelites, I am, or I will be, has sent me to you. Does that sound like a plan? No. Moses said, they won't believe me. And so basically Moses says, you know, this is just not a plan. It's not going to work. And so God said to Moses, okay, look, how about this? Throw your rod down on the ground. And he threw his rod down and it turned into a snake, and of course Moses nearly jumped out of his skin. And God said, well, pick it up. And so he put his hand up, picked it up, and it turned back into a rod. And God said, well, you know, that's a little trick. That can be evidence to prove that, you know, I've sent you. And so this is symbolically, it's interpreted the restoration of Adam. And then God said to Moses, right, stick your hand in your blouse. And he took it in. Now take it out. He took it out, and it all turned leprous. Got leprosy. And God said, right, put it back in again. He put it back in, take it out again, take it out, and it was healed. And then, so this symbolically is the restoration, the corruption restoration of Eve by the Messiah. And then finally God said to Moses, look, take some water from the Nile, pour it onto the sand, and it'll turn into blood. And Moses thought, yeah, I can work with that. And so he said, yeah, that's workable. But, yes?
Should I ask you a question at the end, or?
No, it's just interrupt me whenever you like. Sorry, it's actually, it carries on, but anyway, just...
Okay, I mean, just because the question is not...
I mean, if Moses could interrupt God...
Fair. I mean, it's just like, I've been talking to many of my course mates, and you know, the Bible is easily challengeable academically based on, you know, doesn't make sense, you know, it doesn't, you know, that trick doesn't, you know, just, it's not scientific, you know what I mean? And also, you know, you could say, well, if God can do anything, then that's true, but also, like, I think we learned that God has to sort of, you know, kind of, the principles are applied to everyone, because he created the principle in a way that's kind of set. So, like, how can you reconcile that kind of thing with the miracles?
Well, if you think of it as a miracle, as something supernatural, it's a problem.
Yeah.
But if you think, well, maybe he was just a 2,000 years, what was his name, Darren Brown? Or maybe he was, maybe it's like nothing more than a trick, an extraordinary thing that, at this particular level, I would say that. Maybe it's just an illusion. He was an illusionist, and he could do these sorts of things. I mean, you see these guys on television, you think, how on earth did they do that?
There is a plausible explanation to it, right? There is something that, okay, well, that's
Something psychological with these.
Lots of stuff going on, but it's amazing. When you look at it, you think, it's extraordinary.
The other thing is that I almost struggle with is the symbolism. Like, where does the symbolism come from?
The symbolism comes from the book called The Divine Principle. Do you want me to try and explain it in more detail? I mean, I'm happy to if you want.
No, I mean,
please. Why the snake is.
Yeah, where does for this particular situation?
Okay, so the principle then, it interprets a lot of these things in the Bible through a sort of typology of the three blessings, for example, and so it interprets a lot of these things as being some sense of restoring the three blessings, or sometimes it's a bit sort of stretched and a little bit forced, and so...
A staff is made of wood, and wood is a part of a tree.
Yes.
And Adam is symbolized by a tree.
Yeah, well, I agree.
It's a branch of a tree.
Yes.
Adam himself is a tree of life who became the serpent.
Yeah.
He became like the serpent.
Yeah, so you can see, I mean, you can interpret it in those sorts of ways, but sometimes, as I said, it looks a bit forced.
It's not really necessary.
It's not necessary, but that's the way the principle interprets these things, that these things have particular meanings, restoring the three blessings. And finding within lots of these things in the Bible the sort of idea, the change of lineage, for example. But that's not, I mean, that's the divine principle interprets it in this particular way. That's also the way Christianity also would interpret these sort of things in a similar kind of way, but they would have a different sort of typology that they'd be working with. So it's not unusual.
Why do you think it's important that it's in this moment? Like, why is these miracles like interpreted in this way? Or wow, like, what's the? I think you also asked, like, why is it important, like that moment that Moses does these miracles, and why is it important? You know what I mean? Like,
Why did God give him these three miracles? Well, he was trying to give him something to go on, because Moses is a very practical person, and he realized, he needed something more to be able to convince the Pharaoh and the Israelites that he'd come from God. He didn't have the confidence that just by going there they would pay any attention to him. So these particular miracles were the ones he actually did them with the Pharaoh, but the main place where he did these miracles was with the Israelite leaders. So the first place he went, he didn't go first of all to Pharaoh. First of all, he went to the leaders of the Hebrews, the tribal leaders, and he met with them. They would have known who he was, and he would have said, I had this experience, this encounter with God, and then this would have been some proof that what he was saying was true. He was able to do these miracles. So that's the way it works out in the Bible there. And then, as I said, these are interpreted as to do with this.
Yeah.
Anyway, Moses, though, said, "Oh, my Lord, I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech and of tongue." So the understanding is Moses was a stutterer. He wasn't a good public speaker. And he could have just imagined, trying to give this speech to the Pharaoh and choking up, and everybody just being reduced to laughter. So he said, I'm not eloquent. And so God said to him, okay, I can handle that. I will be your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. And then, really. And Aaron, your brother, he shall speak for you. In other words, you whisper into you tell Aaron, whisper into his ear what to say, and then he's got a good strong voice, he'll deliver the message. Okay? And finally Moses says, "Oh my Lord, send, I pray, someone else." Don't you get it? I don't want the job. So this is what's so interesting in the biblical tradition, is this incredibly active interaction between the prophets and God. They argue with God. God for them was a reality. It was a personal God. This is what it means, that God is personal. You can actually argue with God. You can talk to God. You can work out some kind of arrangement with God. Okay, God, you want me to do this? Well, that's not really practical. Let's come to some kind of compromise. Let's do something, that we can both be happy with. And God compromises. God finds a way to accommodate himself to human, little, whatever we are, things. And that's the way it worked. Anyway, so God at this point got a bit upset with Moses. And so Moses said, okay, I'll do it. And so God said to Moses, right, you're going to work together as a trinity. Look, you can be like me. You can be in the position of me, God. And then Aaron will be like, and your sister Miriam, they can work like in position, like a trinity, Adam and Eve. So it's Moses and his brother Aaron, I seem to vaguely remember, is older than him, and Miriam, his sister. Yeah, Miriam is 7 years older, and Aaron was 3 years older. So Miriam is the oldest. Okay, so Moses then sets off towards Egypt, and then this happens. On the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him and tried to kill him. So the first thing, after Moses takes on the job, God tries to kill him. You might think, well, that's, kind of a funny... Is this in my conditions of employment? What's going on here? But, and this is even more extraordinary, but Zipporah, his wife, took a flint, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it, and said, "Truly you're a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. It was then, she said, a bridegroom of blood by circumcision. So the son was called Gershom. So what's going on here then?
That phrase, bridegroom of blood, means a lot to us now after 4,000 years of development.
Okay, right, let's start off with the first sentence. So why did God try to kill Moses? What's going on here?
It's like a crucible, he's testing his metal, see if he's good enough to...
He's testing him? Why is he testing him?
Because Moses had shown his belief. He had trusted God completely.
So, okay.
There's also the kind of pattern that human beings have to overcome.
Jacob.
Yeah, like Jacob
Okay.
wrestled with the angel.
Right.
Maybe it wasn't actual Lord, it was an
Okay.
angel.
So why do they do that?
Strengthen their character.
Okay. All right, that's what it says here, divine principle. God does not grant a grace to people without a necessary condition. For if he were to do so, Satan would make an accusation. Therefore, when God is about to give grace, he puts a person through a test, either before or after the grace, to prevent Satan's accusation. So why would Satan accuse then? Why does Satan accuse?
Because he hadn't had a son circumcised.
He hadn't what?
He hadn't circumcised the son.
Yeah, well, he's trying to kill him. Why would Satan... No, there's a general principle here. Let's look at the general principle first. God doesn't grant a grace to people without a necessary condition, but if he were to do so, Satan would make an accusation. Why would Satan do that? What is granting a grace then? Give a blessing, okay. And why might somebody accuse?
It's like a
They don't deserve it.
One at a time. Sune?
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't deserve it. You might say, that's not fair. That's not fair. You know how it works? You don't deserve it. You're not qualified to receive that blessing. You're not qualified to be promoted. You're not qualified to get that job. You're not qualified to get this money. You're not qualified, yes? And it becomes a base of accusation. Okay? So that's the condition then, is you have to do something to qualify. You want to get this job? Well, you need to go and study, pass the exams, get your degree in whatever it is, then you're qualified to have that job. Yes, you need to pass through a test. You pass the test, then you qualify for a particular position. Yes, you need to be in a position where you deserve something, and then you can receive all sorts of things, and people feel actually you do deserve it. Because of all that you've been through, because of this, this, and this, and this, you deserve this job. You deserve to win whatever. You deserve all these things, yeah? And people don't say it's not fair, yeah? Because they feel, yeah, you actually deserve it. So this is the way it works spiritually with God and Satan, but also this is just the way it works in the world in which we live. Yeah? So supposing somebody is a chairman of a large company, and they've got a son who's a complete wastrel, and then he gets put on the board of directors. How will the rest of the people in the company feel? Upset. They feel, for several reasons. First of all, they feel that's not fair. You're not qualified. They're better people than you to do that. But also they're worried. Why are they worried? Yes. Supposing Dad dies and he takes over the company and doesn't run it properly, then they're all out of a job. Yeah. So they want to make sure that he is qualified for that job. Yeah, it's just normal. There's nothing wrong with it. Just that's just the way it is. So when God is about to give a grace, he puts a person through a test either before or after the grace to prevent Satan's accusation. So Satan, for example, often accuses God and says to God, if you'd loved me more, then I wouldn't have felt a lack of love, and then I wouldn't have gone and got involved with Eve to get extra love from Adam and Eve. In other words, it's all your fault. Yeah? And so that's why, if to prevent Satan's accusation, God can't do that. Yeah.
Something else that the principle mentions, which I wanted to ask about, was when God puts people through this sort of trial period, and it mentions that he sort of leaves them somehow, or he just sort of leaves them to it. I didn't quite understand what that meant.
Right, they have to pass the test by themselves.
Yeah.
When you go and sit in your exam, you can't put your hand up and say, "Excuse me, sir, I can't remember how to do this. Can you help me?"
Yeah.
You can't do it. So you have to work out how to pass this test of your own responsibility.
Yeah.
You have to think for yourself and work it out what to do. Yes,
Also,
Peter.
in the Old Testament, for example, when the Babylonian king, I think it was Nebuchadnezzar, came to enslave the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
In the Bible, God refers to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. But I just assume that, if you break the principle, then Satan's side can attack you, and somehow, through going through that, you can improve yourself. It doesn't necessarily mean that God sent that person to attack you, but in the realm of the whole principle, where things are working out, in the Bible, God refers to bad people as my servants sometimes.
Yeah.
So in this case, did God actually try to kill Moses, or is it just Satan tried to block him? That was something he had to go through, so God allowed his name to be put in that place.
I mean, it says God tried to kill him, but it doesn't say how.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
So it could just be that God allowed Moses to be attacked.
Yes, in that sense, the traditional biblical understanding is that Satan does God's will because he's testing somebody to see whether they have got the mettle, to see whether they're really qualified. In that sense, Satan's there to help you to be perfect by pointing out all your errors and mistakes and, So, the original name for Satan is just the critic, the one that goes around criticizing, pointing out all the things that need to be improved, basically. So that's my justification. But Zipporah took a flint, so go back to this, took a flint, cut off his son's foreskin, touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Truly you're a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. And it was then, she said, a bridegroom blood by circumcision. So let's try and figure this out. What's the meaning of circumcision? Well, it's removing the blood of death. So it's changing the lineage at the risk of one's life. So the idea here is because of the fall, then Adam and Eve's blood lineage was changed, and they became connected to Satan's blood lineage. And so when you're circumcised, it means you're changing your lineage at the cost of your life. Any of you here when I talked about this with Abraham? Okay, what happens? Any volunteers here to be circumcised? Why not? Pain. Okay, now you can do it with an anesthetic. But anyway, afterwards as well, yeah. Anyway, the point is, we're talking, she didn't have a nice sharp scalpel with an anesthetic and disinfectant. She circumcised them with what? A flint. Yes, a sharp stone. So you can imagine, this is this is a life-risking operation, especially at that time. People could bleed to death. People often did get infected and went gangrenous, and they died. This was something that people did at the risk of their life. And they did this because they're saying, this is who I am. I am on God's side. I belong to God, even at the risk of my life. So nowadays, people often, to show their identity, they wear certain kind of clothes and designer labels and a football scarf around their neck or something. Sometimes they go and put tattoos on. This is the gang I belong to. And people often engrave their identity upon their skin or on the clothes they wear, or, if they're a goth, then they walk around, dressing in certain ways. People express their identity, their sense of the group to which they belong, by the way they dress. Yeah? So for Jews then, they would engrave, in that sense, their identity into their physical body. That became their badge of identity. They changed their lineage at the risk of their life. It's also to the restoration of the right of dominion. And so, if you look at circumcision was introduced with Abraham. So Abraham was originally called Abram. And then later, when God made a covenant with Abraham and he was circumcised, then he changed his name to Abraham. And so this is this idea of developing complete self-control. So in Hebrew, each letter is given a certain numerical value. So the letter A is worth 1, the letter B is worth 2, the letter R is worth 200, the letter M is worth 40. And so how much is Abram worth numerically then? 243, that's right. And then when he changed his lineage, he is circumcised, God made the covenant with him, he gave him an extra A. It's the letter HA actually, ha. And that's worth 5. And so that brings the numerical value of his name up to 248. So in Hebrew sort of anatomy, it's understood that the human body has 248 limbs. Obviously, by the word limb, they mean something different than we do. So they may count each of these segments of the finger as a limb, and, basically, or particular muscle groups, I don't know. Anyway, it comes up to 248. So the tradition here was that before he was circumcised, Abraham had control over 243 limbs of his body, but after he's circumcised, he had control over 248 limbs. In other words, over every single limb of his body. So what extra limbs do you think he gained control over? His eyes. Well, the tradition of the Talmud is he gained control then over his eyes, his ears, and his sexual organ. So this meant that now, when he saw things, he could only see things from God's point of view. Yes, he wouldn't look at things from his self-centered point of view anymore. He could complete self-control. When he listened, he would only listen to things from God's point of view. He wouldn't be going around trying to listen to the latest gossip and bad things about so-and-so. And then he had complete self-control over his sexual organ. So here you've got this idea that through circumcision it's to do the restoration of the right of dominion of mind-body unity. And also this is a sign of the covenant, that God restores people. So God said to Abraham he would make his covenant with his sexual organ, if you actually read it, the meaning of it. And so this then was a way through which he changed and established his identity at the risk of his life. And in the Bible it talks about 3 types of circumcision. Circumcision of the mind, separating, purifying the way in which you think. Circumcision of the flesh, and circumcision of all things. So purifying everything, separating things from Satan, bringing things into the realm of God's dominion, the way we think, feel, and also mind-body unity, and also all things. Okay, any questions? All right, so Moses then said he went on to meet the Hebrew leaders. And Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord has said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. That's these 3 signs. And when they heard the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. So their hearts were comforted when they understood that God cared about them. Yes, they maintained their faith through all this miserable suffering, and that God answered their prayers. So Moses then, he didn't go straight to Pharaoh. First he went to the Hebrew leaders. And because they accepted him and they got this foundation substance, he was able, he brought God's words, he showed these miracles, he proved to them that he'd been called by God, that he was the central person of the foundation substance. They recognized that, they bowed down and worshipped, and so on that foundation he could go to see Pharaoh. Without the support of the Hebrew leaders, he had no foundation to go to the Pharaoh. So they went to meet the Pharaoh, and he said to him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so they may hold a festival to me in the desert." So where does this idea of a festival come from?
Would we have having one, or using it as an excuse to get out?
Yeah. Why did Moses not say, "Let my people go forever"? Why did he say, "Let my people go so they may hold a festival to me in the desert"? Yes, because Moses is a practical person. He thought, what's the likelihood of the Pharaoh letting his entire workforce go forever? Zilch. I need to come up with something practical. Okay, I'm going to ask Pharaoh, can we go into the desert for 3 days to hold a festival, and then we'll all turn up for work again on Monday morning? He thought to himself, I can work with that. I'm sure that's something that, like a compromise that, I can persuade the Pharaoh to go along with. So Pharaoh said, he didn't actually say, we're going to come back. He just said, just want to go and hold a festival. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should pay any attention to him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." So, he talked about the God of Israel, but Pharaoh said, "We're in Egypt here. The God of Israel has no power in Egypt. It's the Egyptian gods that have the power here. Why should I pay any attention to him?" So the Pharaoh then, as a punishment, he increased the workload, and he told the Hebrews that they had to get their own straw for brick making. And so how do the Hebrews react to this? Were they pleased with Moses or not? They thought, "You're a lousy shop steward. You went there, and our conditions of work got worse." And they said to Moses, "May the Lord look upon you and judge you. You've made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." In other words, things are a lot worse. So how do you think Moses felt? Bad. He felt, I've come here to liberate them, and I've just made life worse for them. So what did he do?
I would have been like, "See, God, I told you it was rubbish."
Right. So he didn't think, "Well, I'm going to pack this in." He returned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's brought trouble upon this people, and you've not rescued your people at all." So again, he had this kind of very intimate relationship with God. He's willing to speak his mind to God, tell God what he thought, and had this very close personal relationship with God. Yeah, it's very, you read the Bible and you see what an intimate relationship he had with God. He never, no matter how bad things were, so this is very much the biblical tradition, no matter how bad things were, you went and talked to God about it. Whereas some people think, well, there's so much suffering, I'm going to not believe in God anymore. But the biblical tradition, the worse things get, the more you argue with God and complain to God about it, and tell God what you're playing at here.
God never zapped anybody for doing it.
Sorry?
God never zapped them for doing that.
No, he didn't. No. Anyway, so again, you can see this. It's a very close relationship here. Anyway, so then you had this 10 plagues. And So what should we do here? It's 8:20. Just wondering whether you should stop here or just finish off with the plagues, perhaps. Yes, of course you can.
With the plagues, if I remember rightly, doesn't between each one of them God harden the Pharaoh's heart so that the Pharaoh decides not to let the people go even more?
Yep.
Why does God harden the Pharaoh's heart?
What do you think? Any ideas? Okay. Well,
It's like pulling the string back on a dog.
we'll come to that, and we'll have a look and see. Let's just have a look at the plagues first. So, the first one is a plague of blood, and so Moses went to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, "What evidence have you got that you come from God?" And so Moses went to the Nile, and the Nile, turned to blood. And then Moses went to Pharaoh, said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "No." Moses said, "It's going to be a plague of frogs." And so the plague of frogs came. He went to Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh was upset about the frogs. But he still said he wasn't going to let the people go. And then it became a plague of lice. Shall I go through this now, or shall I go? It's already 8:30. Shall we leave this till next week? It's going to take quite a long time. Actually, going, and then Christabel's question is an important question also. I mean,
Comes back next week.
no,
Next week.
well, it's just that this section is. This is a natural place to stop. That's all. Whereas the next part, you start with the plagues, and then it leads into the Exodus, and then it gets the whole thing there, which is at least quite a long time to go through all that. Yeah, it's probably enough for today. Is that enough for today? I don't want to keep you here all night. No, thank you. Good. And so.